I'm just glad to be able to have a prayer sheet. That's right. It's all on one piece of paper. All right, look, if you would, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. This second epistle, beloved, I write now unto you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance, that you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of the Lord and Savior. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Now, when I read the Bible, I'm always looking for better ways to pray. And in this, you find actually 4 ways to pray better. All right, look, if you would, verse 1. This second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance. One way is to, number 1, remember what God has done. Remember what God has done. Now, you remember Jesus said if you had the faith of a grain of a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, be cast out, and it would happen. Look, I've said this probably before, and it won't be the last time I say this. When you keep a prayer journal of what God's done, I'm going to guarantee this for you. Many things that you ask God to do this week, today, tonight, God has done in your past. And if you would just remember what God has done, it will give you that little grain of faith of a mustard seed to be able to say, I believe you can do this again. That is a huge thing, and we're going to see some of these things in the Bible tonight. Look at verse 2. That you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets. Number 2, always be mindful of what God has said about prayer. If you do that, if you know what God has said about prayer, it would help you. What God has done in the past and what God has said in the past about prayer. If you do both of those things, it'll help your prayer life. Look at the 3rd verse. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust. Number 3, if you would always surrender your will to the Lord's will, not my will be done, but your will be done. If you would do these 3 things in your prayer life, I guarantee your prayer life will change. If you said, Lord, I know what you've done in the past. Lord, I know what you said in the past. And Lord, I want your will to be done. Now look at verse 4. Saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. If you look for the promises of God. Now, that's 4 verses and 4 challenges on prayer. When I try to disciple men and we get into prayer, I always go over this. What's the promise that you're going to pray? Has God ever done this in the past for you? What does God say? Can you find anybody who prayed this kind of a prayer? If I was just to ask you as we go through the Bible, if your mind would think, where's the first time somebody prayed for healing? Where was the first time somebody prayed for healing in the Bible? Do you remember? How about where was the first time somebody prayed for a wife in the Bible? Well, if you go through Genesis, Adam didn't pray for a wife. He knew he needed one. He's like, you got a mate? You got a mate? You got a mate? I don't got a mate. God goes, okay, go to sleep. Okay, all right. All right. Do you remember Abraham sent his servant Eliezer out? And Eliezer's like, what happens if I can't find a woman for you? And Abraham's like, if you can't find a woman, then you can come back. Everything will be okay. And when Eliezer got to the well, did he pray? You prayed, right? How about this? Where's the first time in the Bible that somebody prayed for someone to get saved? Someone to be saved, that God would spare them. Abraham praying for Lot, right? You see, what you do is you try to say, okay, Lord, in this situation that I'm in, where in the Bible have you already went over somebody praying for this prayer? I don't know if you've ever heard of John R. Rice. He was a great preacher back in the 70s and 80s. He started the Sword of the Lord, John R. Rice. And John R. Rice, he felt God put a calling on him to pray for women who couldn't get pregnant. And he would ask the women, how many of you want to get pregnant and you can't get pregnant, if you would stand? And then he would take time and he would pray for them. And you know how it is, sometimes you're not paying attention. You know, I don't know if you've ever been at an altar call and somebody's like, you know, raise your hand if you feel like the Lord's telling you you need to get saved, you know. You're not paying attention, you just put your hand up. Well, a lady, this is how it all started. This lady, she just stood up with everybody else. Okay? And they were like, yo, what are you doing? And she's like, are we leaving? No, John just prayed for you to have a baby. And lo and behold, she did. And she was old. And she was like, John, all right. Kind of like you with your prayers of rain. You know? Well, John and Rice used to do that. And, you know, they asked him, where did you come up with this? He said, you know, 1 Samuel was one of the favorite books of mine. And when Hannah prayed in 1 Samuel, he just took that. And he would always pray that way. But if you look at how God has shown you in the scriptures, I'm going to tell you this, probably everything that we pray for, somebody prayed for in the Bible. You just need to find that thing. All right? The next thing you see that I went over. So you look for not your will, but his to be done. And then you look for a promise. All right? And again, you should have a promise with everything. If you were ever to see my prayer sheet, you would see as many people as I pray for, yeah, I got verses down. All right? And there's probably, as I read through the Bible, I see a new thing to pray for. I just go to my prayer sheet, I just put that at the top. Yeah, Dave, you had something? Okay. All right. Look, if you would, Psalm 40 and verse 5. Psalm 40 and verse 5. Go ahead, Lewis. All right, notice what David says here in Psalm 40, verse 5. Many, O Lord, my God, are thy wonderful works which thou hast done. Do you remember what God has done, his wonderful works to you? You should. That's one of the things you should put down. God, what are your wonderful works that you've done to me? You know, many times when I'm preaching, I'll tell you what God's done in my past. I'll give you something. And many times during the week, I'll feel like, Lord, I feel like you're telling me to preach this sermon. Like, Lord, give me some illustrations of what you've done in my life that would fit this situation. And sometimes I don't even share them all. It's just sometimes like, wow, Lord, I remember that. Yes, I remember this. You know? So God has done wonderful works he's done in the past for you. Sandy, if you would, Psalm 52, verse 9. Psalm 52, verse 9. All right. Notice he says here, I will praise thee forever because you've done it. That it right there. How many times has God, you know God did it. There was no way for anybody else to do it. And you were like, God, you had to do that. You had to do that. I couldn't do it, and I couldn't rearrange this. And, you know, there was a time in my life where I was just like, Lord, I'm tired of dating. I'm tired of this. And I seen a verse in Isaiah. It said, I will bring thy seed from the west. And so I was like, Lord, I'm from the west. But there's got to be a woman out there. And she said, bring my seed to me. And Lord, I'm willing to go because I'm from California. So Lord, send me to that woman. And I was like, Lord, I'm not going to play the field. I'm not going to play the field because if you play the field, you're playing the fool. And then Diane waves to me. And Like God had to do that. There's no way I would have walked up to her. None. If God didn't do that, and if you were to find some of when I was young, some of the things I wrote down about how God, would you please do something extraordinary that I would know this is the one for me. And you know what? She was at the east and I was at the west. Amen. You know what? I tell you, what things has God done that you know, God, I couldn't even orchestrate that. You had to do that. You had to. You know what? Those are great things to remember. When we were visiting Tim down in the hospital, I always like doing this with couples that I'm just meeting. I said, how did you two to get together? And to hear the story of how Tim and his wife got together, it is an amazing, crazy story. It's crazy. She had a dream about a moose. All right? And what is on the Michigan flag? A moose. All right? And she's like, God told me that he was going to give me a moose. And here he's from Michigan. And he had a bald head. And it's a big, and it was wild, you know? It's like, God, you have to do these things. I can't do them. And one of those things that if you've seen what God has done in the past, that you knew, God, you got to do this. I couldn't do it any other way. In your situation tonight, there might be something that you're like, Lord, I don't know how you'd be able to do it. Every time the Olympics comes around, it reminds me of when we were praying for a lady's brother in North Carolina, and he was in England. And we were praying that God would minister and save his soul. And he went to the Olympic Village, and they were passing out tracts, and he took a tract at the Olympic Village and got saved. And so every time the Winter Olympics comes around, I just think about that. Like, Lord, how you arrange things is amazing. It really is, you know? So remember what God has done that you know only God could do it. Todd, if you would, Psalm 66:16. 66:16. What he has done for what? My soul. Your soul. What's your soul? Your mind, your will, and your emotion. When I first got saved, my mom, she couldn't believe it. And I was like, I want to go to church. And I came home one day from church, and she's like, what? I said, Mom, I need nice shoes. I don't want to wear tennis shoes to church. And my mom was like, you hate hard shoes. Like, God must have saved you, because there's no way I could get you into any hard shoes, you know? When you look at what God has done for your soul, your mind, your will, and your emotions. Sebastian, last Sunday night, was giving great testimony here. We stayed quite late. We were giving great how God's changed your desires. And it's a great thing to hear, how God's changing your soul, changing your desires, changing your will and your want to. That's a great thing to, one, recognize. God, you're doing this. I'm telling you, we don't know how God changes our desires, but he does. It's a good thing to point out, especially when you're struggling with some kind of sin. Psalm 71:19. Ed, if you would, Psalm 71:19.
Thy righteousness also, O God, is very high. Who has done great things, O God? Who is like unto thee?
Okay. You know, that's one thing about the Lord. There's nobody like him. So when God does something, it just shows you what kind of character God is and how he does things. So perfect and so good. Dave, if you would, Psalm 78, verse 4. 78:4. You know, it says here, don't hide them. Don't hide what God has done. When you repeat what God has done, it's going to help your prayer life. If you think about that, if you would just know what God can do. And, you know, many times you're giving a testimony, you have a chance to give a testimony. You forget that other people are here. And so when you give a testimony, you might just give that strength to somebody who needs to hear that. What God did for the ladies in the Bible study with Angelica, with Rhonda, and with Jody was an amazing thing. To hear that kind of testimony is like, wow, that's amazing. And how healing that is. You know, you have to be willing to declare what God has done. Christine, Psalm 98, verse 1. 98:1. God does marvelous things. Not just things that are average. God does marvelous things. Things that we can't even understand. Diane, if you would, Psalm 105:5. Remember, God says, remember them, and we should, and the judgments of his mouth. Look, God says in Psalms, there are set laws of judgment. You can't change them. If I go on the top of this roof and jump off, and I say just before I jump off, I believe I can fly. There's a set law of judgment, isn't there? That's called gravity. No matter what I believe, right? The first time I ever went up, we built an airplane. This one church that I was at, we built a plane. It wasn't like Lewis's. It's one that's concealed. And we went up, and the guy knew that I had motion sickness. I was like, look, I feel like I'm going to throw up. He's like, slide that window back then. And I was like, you're going to make me throw up? This is our first trip. You know, everybody, the whole church is waiting down there for us. And he's like, well, let's see how good your mind over matter is. Keep on saying to yourself, I will not throw up. That ain't going to help me. There's a law, okay? It's as good as gravity. There's a set law of judgment with me. It's coming out. You know, look, no matter what I'm doing, it's like God has set laws of judgment. And we should remember God's goodness and what he's done for us and the judgments of his mouth. Jeremy, if you would, Psalm 106:21 and 22. Look at, they forgot God, their Savior. The great things he's done in Egypt. We're going to be going through the book of Joshua. Hopefully Sunday we'll start a new book. You know how many times God's going to tell them in Joshua, you're forgetting what I did in Egypt. You know, when you forget salvation, when you forget how God's delivered you, it's a sad day. When you think about all the goodness that God's shown you, and he's saying, you ain't writing this down? Look, my friend, it's a beautiful thing. You know, one of the things I love about Facebook, you take a picture, and it'll remind you 5 years ago you did this, 7 years ago you did this. And, you know, many times I just send it to our kids. Look what you were doing 12 years ago. Look what you did 10 years ago. You know, Christine texted me today and said some things, and it was just like, Lord, I really needed to hear that right then. You know? Yeah, Jeremy. Yeah. You know, when you forget what God has done in the past, it's like just a lot. There's so many good things that God has done that will take care of your lack of faith. He says they forgot God, their Savior, the great things he's done. All right? Sebastian, if you would, Psalm 109:27. Psalm 109:27. You know, one thing I pray for each one of you every night, Lord, may your hand be upon them for good and not for evil. You know, this is the hand of God. You know, a lot of times I get calls during the week. How do I know this is the will of God? Last Sunday night, we were here pretty late. But one of those things was that question I got asked, not from Sebastian, from somebody else. You know, how do I know this is the will of God? Well, look what it says, that they may know that this is the hand of God. This is thy hand. When you start recording down what God has done and you're paying attention, it's amazing that you'll be able to see and start understanding. Look, I've been surfing so many times that I know what it feels like to catch a wave. I know right here, when your body starts getting that feeling, you better jump on that board. You wait a little bit, you're going to miss it. When I was watching that surfing movie, I was like, wow, you know, That girl had one arm. It's hard to paddle with one arm. And you better get that jump really, really early. If you don't, you ain't going to get that wave. And that girl with one hand is getting waves. I was like, wow, that takes a lot of skill. Because your feet can't be off the board on the side. Your feet got to be in the back. And she only had one arm. I'll tell you what, you had to be ready. Look, in the Christian life, you should start getting that feeling like, Lord, I know, I see you moving. This is how you move. When you see that, that's an exciting thing. When you start seeing those things come to pass, it's like, okay, I see you working on that person. That's some great times that you got to remember your prayer life. Let me just go through these last ones here, and then we'll go to prayer. The Lord hath done great things for us, whereof we are glad. Remembering what God has done is going to make you glad. Look, if you would, we'll skip 2 Peter 3:2 and 3:3. We'll go to 2 Peter 3:4, saying, where is the promise of this coming? Here's some promises again to remember. Hitherto have you asked nothing in my name. Ask and you shall receive, that your joy would be full. That's a promise. Ask in my name, so your joy would be full, that you'll have answers to prayer. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you shall ask what you will. It'll be done. That's a promise. And notice what Peter said. Be mindful of his words. Be mindful of the promises. Look at whatsoever we ask, 1 John 3:22, we receive of him because we keep his commandments and do those things that are pleasing in his sight. These are promises. I know if I'm living right, my prayer life should be on fire. I should be able to have a great prayer life. Jesus saith unto him, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. For verily I say unto thee, that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, be thou removed and be cast in the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe in those things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. You know, this is a way to always increase your prayer life, and I pray that you would start writing down what God's done. I want to tell you this, not only for your own sake, but for somebody else's. I've had a diary since I was about 12 years old. I've not always kept a diary straight through, but I've seen all of my kids read my diaries. Some stuff I didn't want them to read. But I've seen each one of them say, hey, Dad, what happened here? And it's an amazing thing to be able to go over the struggles in your life. I remember Scotty one night was sitting down with me, and he was looking at what I wrote. And he was like, you were really struggling here. And I was like, yeah. And I was like, give me that book back, okay? You know, but it was important because sometimes our kids don't think that we ever struggle, you know? And there was some struggle in there going on. If you would write down what God has done, you know, I want to say this to you. You know somebody right now who's struggling. And you know, you might know somebody right now who they say that they've been saved, but they're not living for the Lord. If you could go back and just say, let me show you what God did for me when I was in your situation. And you go back through and say, hey, read this. You know what? Many times it'll give somebody faith. It'll give somebody faith. And believe me, I have some highlights in my life, especially when I'm going through this kind of health stuff. Like, I remember I read Psalm 1 to Psalm 77 without stopping. It's a lot of Psalms. With a nurse sitting right by my bed. She kept on saying, you still going to read? I said, I ain't found my answer yet. And when I got to Psalm 77, God rebuked me and I found my answer. And that nurse, she's like, what's making you cry? She grabbed Psalm 77 and started reading it. And I was crying. Put the book down. She opened it up. She's like, I've been waiting to figure out when God's going to speak to you. And she read that. We talked about it. It was a powerful time. Right? Let's remember what God has done. I challenge you to do that in your own prayer life. Right? Any questions? You have any questions for me? All right, ladies. Back to, yeah, Jeremy. Yeah. All right. Pray for his family then. Amen. All right. Thanks for coming tonight. Appreciate it.